don't underestimate the power of leading by example, because it's not just the foods that you're buying, it's all of the people around you, it's all the people in your community that, we're influenced so much, but more by what people do rather than what they say. And so, just as powerful as the decisions you're making is the example that you're setting.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to my show. I am your host, Nimai Delgado, and today we have a very special guest. His name is Simon Hill. He has his master's in nutritional science. He is a podcast of a very successful show called the Plant Proof Podcast, and he is a new author of a brand new book called The Proof is in the Plants. And he's also a good friend of mine, and he's an Aussie, and I love hearing him talk. I love his accent. So welcome to the show, man.
Nimai, thank you so much for having me. Andres put us through the brain busters early.
Yeah, getting ready for the mic checks.
And I passed that test, so it must have been the blueberries that I had this morning.
Yeah, man, how you been? So we just talked about you're coming in from Australia. It's about 5 a.m. your local time.
Yeah,
It's about 12 p.m. here.
I've been
in
here
LA.
for a week or so now, so I've gotten over the jet lag. But yeah, enjoying sunny Los Angeles as always, and it's been fun to catch up with you.
How has the contrast between Australia and LA been so far?
In terms of the
Just
management of COVID and the lockdowns
just a general feel, the atmosphere.
well, I guess, I mean, I live in Sydney and in Bondi, which is beachside, so I've been very lucky in terms of being, great weather all year, and we have been locked down a lot, but I've still had access to the beaches and being able to exercise and get outside. So my experience is perhaps a little different to the average Australian. I think life's been pretty tough in Australia for the last year, particularly in Melbourne, where people have been locked down for 6+ months. So you can imagine what that does to the overall morale and mental health side of things. So coming here, it does feel a lot more open, and people are still wearing masks, but the community is open, and businesses are trading, and so I'm hopeful that Australia kind of follows suit in the coming months, which it looks like it will. It's just taking a little longer.
Yeah, we've been really blessed here in LA too. I mean, my experience has been similar to yours, in the fact that I've still been able to really prioritize my health and the things that really allow me to feel healthy, which means getting outside, getting in the sun, exercising, eating healthy, all of the basic foundations for optimal health. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to get you on the show, so we could talk about this a little bit more. There's a lot of confusion around what is healthy, what is unhealthy, what dietary camp you belong to, and some of the information that's being shared online. It's confusing, man. It's confusing, even for somebody that knows about nutrition.
Very
it's
divisive.
confusing. Yeah,
It's funny, right? Because those other pillars, there's no one debating the benefits of sleep, and there's no sleep wars. This is how you do it. This is how you don't do it. Or exercise. There are different modalities, but there's not really the kind of tribalism and divisiveness that exists with nutrition. And I'm not surprised that the average person's confused. Paleo, low fat, high fat, low carb, high carb, Mediterranean, pescatarian, vegan, whole food, plant based. If you're an everyday person who's living a very busy lifestyle, raising a family, perhaps a single mother, and you don't have the time to be trolling through the science and all the skills to kind of make sense of it, it's difficult to navigate.
Yeah, as someone that promotes vegan lifestyle, I'm constantly being bombarded with people coming to me for information, for advice, also coming to me showing me how unhealthy veganism can
Mm,
be, or asking questions, or and it sometimes, it can be very confusing even for me,
mm,
because I'm not a researcher like yourself. I have a couple certifications, and I've been able to practically apply a lot of what I've learned and share that information publicly on my profile on social media. But how, like, how did you get into nutritional science? I know that you just completed writing your book, which is right here. The proof is in the plants, and I can imagine that you've spent countless hours
mm,
going through all of the research, taking a look at the entire landscape, and being able to distill it into a book. I'm sure is very
mm,
difficult, because there's so much nuance and there's so many different scenarios and so many other considerations when it comes to what is the optimal diet,
mm.
if that even exists for so how did you end up where you are here and the author of this book?
Yeah, so maybe we work our way up to where what I think is the optimal diet,
Yeah.
and kind of how I define that in the book, which is probably a little different to what many may expect given the title of the book.
Hmm.
But for me, my interest in this space, or in science in general, and a real love for science, goes back to when I was a little kid. And I can remember coming home, or hopping into my dad's car. There would always be scientific papers on the seat, piled up high. In his office, there was studies everywhere. On the kitchen table, studies everywhere, and it drove my mother mad. These, these, there was paper trails everywhere, and um,
He was a medical doctor.
yeah. So my
Yeah.
dad is a doctor,
Mm.
and then has a PhD in physiology. Has spent 30 plus 40 years probably by now, researching how our arteries work, but at a very microscopic level, and really contributing to the scientific literature that's looking at risk factors for type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And so I was surrounded by that from a
Mhm.
very early age. I'd spend weekends with my dad going into his laboratory and see the microscopes and play with them. And
Mhm.
I could quite clearly see how important science was to us as a community. We we have hypotheses and we have intuition, and science is a way of testing those. And when we can test those, and we can work out, get closer to the truth, we can make improvements in the way that we're living and help people live healthier, feel healthier in their day to day, and feel healthier for longer. And when I was 15 years old, on the weekends, my dad and myself and my brother, my parents got separated when I was about 10 years old. And we used to spend time with dad on the weekends going and exploring an area in Australia, in Victoria, called the Yarra Valley. And this is a quite a famous wine district. And we would explore. Dad liked to go to lots of the little wineries, because then you could have an opportunity to often connect with the actual winemaker.
Mhm.
And if you could hear from the winemaker themselves, you could often, really feel their passion for what they were doing. And that was kind of a bit of I guess, a lesson that my dad wanted to impart on myself and my brother. And on one particular day, we were out, we were having a great day. It was a Sunday afternoon, driving around. Dad had an old MGB, which is like a British kind of classic racing car, and it was a convertible, and we're driving around. And on this day, it was just Dad and I, and we're driving back to his place, which was in the country, in an area called King Lake, which is a long way away from Melbourne, the city.
Mhm.
And I could sense that he was experiencing some discomfort. I could see it on his face. He was kind of like grabbing at his chest, and rubbing his chest. And I asked him, is everything okay? And he said he was experiencing some chest pain. And he played it down and reassured me that everything was okay. And so we proceeded to go home. And I remember we cooked dinner, and I inquired again, and he said everything was fine. So
Mhm.
thinking that everything was normal, I headed off to bed. And a little while after, I heard some cluttering around in the kitchen, loud enough to wake me up. And thinking back to the car ride home, I thought I better go and check, if Dad's okay. And I went out, and by this time, this was like the first time that I'd ever seen fear in my dad's expression.
Mhm.
Fear had settled in, and there was no denying what he was experiencing anymore. And I've come to learn this is actually quite common when someone is experiencing an acute problem with their health is an initial stage of denial.
Denial,
Yeah,
yeah.
try and pretend that it's not there and maybe it will go away.
Mhm.
And I mean, we even do that in a chronic way as well with our health, and often don't go and see a doctor, because if we go and see a doctor, then we make this problem a reality. We bring it into the
Mhm.
world,
Mhm.
so we can sit on these issues for a long time, and that can be dangerous. But in this scenario, it was an acute health concern, and my dad was out of breath. He was losing color in his face, and he was actually making his way to call 000, which in Australia is like 911.
Mhm.
And he had the emergency on the other end of the line, and I took over that phone call and described to them what he was experiencing, and the last few hours what he had experienced in the car ride home. And they said, based on where you're located, because we were so remote and so far from the nearest hospital, we need to send a helicopter.
Mhm.
And by this moment, that was when I really realized, like, this is a very serious issue.
Mhm.
And my dad at this time, he was 41. He had no prior clinical diagnosis, no health issues. He was not reliant on the healthcare system. He was not taking any medications. For all intents and purposes, he was representative of a young Australian father living a typical Australian lifestyle. And he would work out, every week, 3, 4 times a week. He wasn't necessarily the fittest guy on earth, but he
Mhm.
wasn't morbidly obese, and
Mhm.
wasn't someone that you would look at and describe as unhealthy.
Mhm.
And uh, the helicopter arrived very quickly, and they they came in and quickly scooped him up off the floor and put him onto a stretcher and hooked him up to oxygen and checking all his vital signs. And all of this is happening at like a rapid pace. I was 15, so I it was happening so fast that I was unable to process it at
For
the
sure.
time.
For sure.
And I couldn't fit in the helicopter. So they said to me, you can trail behind in an ambulance that came by road. And I did that. And on the way to the hospital, I called my mother and said, she should probably come and bring my brother to the hospital, meet us, and this is what had happened. And we got to the hospital, and it felt like an eternity, waiting
Mhm.
to find out. We knew that this was obviously very serious, but we were also, very grateful for the medical care and the fact
Mhm.
that, we were so privileged to have this access to this helicopter that could come and so quickly get him to really high quality care. Uh, and they came out, and the doctor said to us that we've saved your dad's life. He's had a severe heart attack. And, at that moment, that was all that we were concerned by. And so
Mhm.
we were very, very grateful. And the next day, and this is quite common, you do a bit of a family meeting at the hospital. And, you know, dad he was stable by then, and could also process information and kind of make sense of what had happened. And the cardiologist sat us down, and my brother was 18, I was 15, and he had taken my dad's history. And my grandfather, my dad's dad, had also had a heart attack. His was when he was in his 60s, so a little bit later. And the cardiologist said, to my brother and I, you guys are pretty much young men, and cardiovascular disease runs in families. So you need to start getting screened, and this is something that you'll want to keep an eye on as you get older, which is in itself good advice. But the
Mhm.
conversation really stopped there. And so with that advice, I kind of left, and my brother did as well, with a bit of a sort of a, a disempowering
Mhm.
kind of feeling, right? It's it's as if that my dad had a heart attack at 41, my grandfather had a heart attack. This is the genetic card that we've been dealt,
Mhm.
and what's to say that our story is going to be any different? Particularly given my dad was just living the same lifestyle as everyone else. So for many years, we just felt that this was our genetic fate. So fast forward around 10 years, and I'm living in Sydney now, and my brother, he's still living in Melbourne, and he and his fiance at the time, Lauren, who's now his wife, they were coming up to spend 2 weeks with me, and he called me a few months before coming up and said, "Hey, just want to give you a little bit of a heads up. Lauren and I have changed our approach to eating." And I was like, "Okay, cool." And essentially, he just wanted to let me know so that I could shop accordingly and
Mhm.
choose appropriate restaurants and whatnot. And at that time, they had adopted a pescatarian diet. So they had cut out red meat and poultry and were eating a kind of largely plant based diet with some fish. And his rationale was he'd been listening to some information, and that was suggesting that eating in this manner could help you lower your risk of cardiovascular disease. And in fact, that there were populations who have eaten like this for a long time and really don't even have cardiovascular disease. And it's really not normal to experience a heart attack or a stroke. And given what my dad had been through and our grandfather, my brother felt that that was really important and powerful information. So
Mhm.
uh, a week before he comes up, he calls me up again, and he says, "We've changed our diet again." And I was thinking, what now? And he said, "We've removed the fish." And at that point, I was really just a little lost for words, thinking, well, what's left? If you remove the
Mhm.
last bit of animal protein from your diet, and at this time, I was working with AFL footballers and had been in the sort of gym culture, fitness culture,
Mhm.
where the prevailing sort of idea and approach to food is more animal protein, the better.
Mhm.
And so this was a very foreign way of thinking about food for me. And I actually had no friends who were vegetarians or vegans or any experience with this style of eating at all. But I've always been very receptive and open minded and willing to try new cuisines and flavors and experiment with food. And so I said to him, "Okay, well, that's fine. He's a really good cook, and so's Lauren. They love to do lots of cooking at home. So I knew that they would help out a lot when they came
Mhm.
up. And so
Mhm.
he did make that clear. So they came up, and they also did some research and found some restaurants that catered with vegetarian, vegan, plant based, completely plant based meals. And it was a really fun couple of weeks. I tried a whole lot of new dishes, plant based lasagna, and we were having plant based pizza at home, and went out to some restaurants and had fantastic meals. And uh, there was no sort of trying to convince me of changing my diet through this 2 weeks. They were just doing their own thing and
Mhm.
sharing that experience with me through good food.
Mhm.
And so at the end of the 2 weeks, I was very curious I knew that now I knew that, okay, from a flavor point of view and an experience point of view, I wouldn't be sacrificing if I
Mhm.
was going to eat more plant-based meals. And so, given our family history of cardiovascular disease, perhaps I should look into this. And, my undergraduate degree being physiotherapy was a science based degree. And I did an honors year in that and conducted my own literature review and then my own study and wrote that up. So I had some experience in reading science.
Mhm.
So my initial thought was, why don't I dig into the studies? And I really I worked out two things. One, I was very quick to see that people have very polarizing views when it comes to food, and there were lots of different contradictory ideas about what an optimal diet is. Are animal fats healthy? Are they unhealthy? Are carbs healthy? Are
Mhm.
they unhealthy? Are vegetable oils healthy? Are they unhealthy? And at that stage, even with the scientific training that I had, which wasn't nutrition focused, but it was a little bit and more than the average person, I was bamboozled.
Mhm.
I would read one thing that sounded compelling, then I would read something else that was compelling, and they were very contradictory. And what I realized is nutrition science as a science is actually very unique. And it's like a different language compared to other forms of science like biomedical science.
Mhm.
Science looking at, for example, a drug versus a placebo. It's very different to nutrition. Nutrition, there often is not a placebo. When we're talking about a food, where we're thinking about what exposure amount, what person, are we talking about a child, an adult, elderly, male, female, pregnant, not pregnant, compared with what? If you're eating a food, what would it be displacing from the diet? And so there are all these moving parts that make nutrition science very special, um, but also uh, give it the potential to a whole plethora of different interpretations
Mhm.
of that science, and with that, you get a lot of different varying opinions. And so I quickly realized that I needed to have more skills to be able to actually make sense of the science.
Mhm. To be able to discern what was,
Yeah,
yeah,
I
where
was ill equipped,
where you landed. Yeah.
and
Makes
so
sense.
uh, but very curious, and it was like a new passion. I could feel that it was I was getting joy out of trying to decipher it, even though there
Mhm.
was frustration. But it was enough there to know that this was something I wanted to pursue, and so I enrolled in masters in nutrition science and went back to university, and my primary goal of that was to better understand what we should eat as
Mhm.
humans. Firstly, for myself and for my family and friends, um, and then slowly, as I was gathering more and more information, I realized where most people are confused, and I became s- sort of obsessed, I guess, with breaking down the science and giving it to
Mhm.
people in a way that hopefully clears the confusion and gives them confidence to make better food choices, which is where Plant Proof sort of
Mm.
was born. Um, so it was it was me going back and doing the master's in nutrition science, which ultimately at the start of this conversation we spoke about what is an optimal diet. And it was through that process, disseminating the research, that I was able to identify that the optimal diet really is not one single diet or dietary brand. And, these sort of names that we've kind of made up, whether it's vegan or vegetarian or pescatarian or Mediterranean or flexitarian or omnivorous, but is really defined by a set of characteristics. And when I when I say that, what I mean is a diet that's low in saturated fat, and we can get into perhaps some of the science that I came across that speaks to that. But low in saturated fat, a good amount of unsaturated fats. It's rich in fiber and it's low in ultra processed foods. And when you put that together, that becomes a diet naturally that is predominantly plant based. It
Mm-hmm.
could be exclusive as well, but it's predominantly plant based, where the majority of calories are coming from fruits and vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds. Now, there is some room within that to do that in a Mediterranean way with some fish and potentially some chicken and low fat dairy, but they're not going to be overly emphasized like a standard Western diet.
Mm-hmm.
That said, it could also be done in a vegetarian way, or it could be a completely whole food, plant based diet where there is no animal products.
So what was the deciding factor for you? Because it sounds like you disseminated a lot of literature, and I'm sure there was that confusion that you spoke of, and then there had to have been a tipping point for you to be like, okay, there's enough proof here for me to live this way and start practicing this. What was maybe there was a certain piece of literature that was like, like this makes sense now. Like I'm just gonna do this.
Yeah, so initially I was like laser focused on heart disease,
Uh huh.
because that was important to me. I would come to learn a long time later that a heart healthy diet is also a liver healthy diet, is a kidney healthy diet, is a brain healthy diet. But at the start, I was focused right in on what is it that causes our arteries to clog up and result in a heart attack or a stroke. In my dad's case, a heart attack. And I went all the way back to 1909. And I'm not sure many people realize this, but most of the research on heart disease, looking at what does cause atherosclerosis, and atherosclerosis is basically a fancy word in science for plaque building up in the artery. So if you imagine like a hose, and you can look where the water's flowing through it. If
Mm-hmm.
that hose starts to become blocked, then it's much harder for the water to flow through. In the case of our arteries, that that artery becomes blocked with cholesterol, fatty buildup, and then it makes it harder for the freshly oxygenated blood to flow through to the heart tissue. The heart is made of muscle. And that's what allows it to pump,
Mm-hmm.
which is how we pump freshly oxygenated blood throughout the body. Um, so I wanted to really work out what is it within our lifestyle that causes these arteries to clog up. And 1909, there was a Russian researcher. His last name was Ignatowski. And this guy decided, and I'm not sure how I really feel about animal experiments these days, but a lot of this research did start in animals. And for what it's worth, it has given great understanding of cardiovascular disease today. Um, so he decided to feed, at the time, the early 1900s, cardiovascular disease was thought to be just part of aging. It was just a normal process of aging and not lifestyle driven. What he decided to do was feed a completely animal based diet to rabbits, and rabbits are herbivores. They don't normally eat animal foods. And he found that feeding them meat, milk, and eggs, he could very quickly see fatty streaks within their arteries, the start of this plaque being laid down. And that was a very interesting early observation. And actually, his sort of theory for what was happening there was not that the fat in these foods or the cholesterol in these foods was causing that, but that protein in the animal foods was accelerating aging. Because remember, at that time, this clogging of the artery, the prevailing idea was it's just aging. And
Mm-hmm.
so he thought, okay, increasing protein in the diet is contributing to increase in the rate of aging. 4 years later, another researcher, Nikolai Anishkov, another a guy, same city, St. Petersburg, Russia. It was all happening in Russia at this stage, and he he was looking at the arteries and looking at the plaque that was building up, and he was able to identify that within this plaque, that fatty buildup, it's cholesterol.
Mm-hmm.
And so he got thinking and thought, well, maybe it's not protein in these animal foods. Maybe it's the fact that they contain cholesterol. So he ran another experiment, and he essentially, like a randomized trial, again with rabbits. He fed one group just sunflower oil, which is a cholesterol-free plant-based oil. And then he fed the other group sunflower oil with cholesterol infused into it. Okay. And what he could quickly see was the rabbits that were fed the sunflower oil with the cholesterol quickly developed these fatty streaks in their arteries,
Hmm.
the early signs of atherosclerosis, as had been observed in humans at the time. Whereas the rabbits that were just fed sunflower oil didn't develop any fatty streaks. Now, that really should have been a study that then resulted in a huge amount of science quickly looking at cardiovascular disease in humans. But sadly, what happened was straight after that experiment, some other researchers tried to replicate that in rats and in dogs. And what they found was that in those animals, it feeding cholesterol to those animals didn't result in any fatty streaks. And what they missed at the time was that different animals do uh, cholesterol is raised by different parts of our diet in different animals. So in the rats and in the dogs, cholesterol in the diet wasn't raising cholesterol in their blood, right?
Hmm.
And that's why they didn't see the development of the plaque. Okay, but what they didn't identify at the time was that the most important factor is something in the diet raising cholesterol in the blood, and then that results in the buildup of the fatty streaks. Um, it was about 30 years later that a researcher in the 1950s, this was, and at this time, the reason why researchers were going back and were interested in these early experiments was in America, cardiovascular disease mortality, death from cardiovascular disease had skyrocketed. You know, it was now responsible for 50% of deaths in the country. So it was essentially spiraling out of control. So there was, national interest. And the president in 1944, he died of heart disease in America, President Roosevelt. And so researchers at this time, they went back and looked at the early experiments in the rabbits and thought, okay, well, maybe the metabolism in rats and in dogs and in humans is different to rabbits. But what about if there is a component of a human diet that does raise cholesterol levels?
Hmm.
It might not be that the same as a rabbit where you feed it cholesterol and that is what increases cholesterol in the blood. It might be something else. And this is where they quickly were able to identify through a series of experiments, a bunch of different researchers, Kinsella, Ansel Keys, who's like quite, you know, well known these days. They were able to see that in humans, cholesterol, dietary cholesterol, it does play a small role in your cholesterol levels in your blood, but not a huge role like in the rabbit. But what does matter is saturated fat. And so they were able to identify that saturated fats in the diet will significantly increase the amount of blood cholesterol,
Hmm.
and polyunsaturated fats will significantly decrease it. Now, saturated fats predominate in animal foods, and polyunsaturated fats predominate in vegetable oils and plant-based foods. So they ran all of these very sophisticated studies in metabolic ward, bringing people in, very highly controlled studies, literally feed them saturated fat, jack their cholesterol up, feed them the vegetable oils, and the cholesterol would go down. And so, those studies at that time essentially created this hypothesis that okay, in humans, if humans are eating a lot of saturated fat and have a high blood cholesterol, they're going to have increased risk of developing plaque in their artery and heart disease.
Hmm.
And so the next logical step is you can't keep people in a metabolic ward and feed them saturated fat
Till you see what
to
happens.
see what happens,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So the next logical step is to go out and look at populations, and different populations eat different diets, and identify, in certain populations where they're eating, for example, more saturated fat and they have higher blood cholesterol, do they have increased risk of heart disease?
Hmm.
And there, one of the major studies that was done at this time was by Ansel Keys. He performed a study called the Seven Countries Study, and uh, this included Japan and Greece and Finland and the Netherlands and Yugoslavia, um, USA, and so there were 7 countries. There were 16 cohorts through those. So some of the countries had more than one group, and he clearly was able to see that the more saturated fat in the diet, the higher their cholesterol levels and the higher their risk of heart disease.
Hmm.
And to give you an idea, Finland was one of the countries I didn't mention, was in that study, and their saturated fat intake was at about 22% of calories. And they had around the highest incidence of heart disease in the world. Whereas Japan and Greece had saturated fat intakes at about 6 to 7% of their calories, of largely plant-based diets, not a lot of animal foods, and they had significantly lower rates of heart disease.
Hmm.
So I'm working through all of this research and really beginning at this stage, and this is just preliminary research. We have so much more than this now. I'm only up to 1950. um, so I'm beginning though to really see the power of diet in shaping our health, and seeing that a lot of these heart attacks and strokes that we have accepted as just being a normal part of our society, other populations aren't experiencing those.
Hmm.
So this was, very compelling. And to give you an idea as to how powerful this is, I mentioned Finland. And in East Finland, there's an area called North Karelia. And in the 1970s, they actually had the men in North Karelia had the highest rates of heart disease ever recorded. And their diet was 22 to 24% of their calories from saturated fat. They had gone through rapid growth. They were experiencing increase in affluence, changing of uh, the source of their calories. The dairy industry had really started to prosper,
Hmm.
and times were good. And animal food consumption increased a lot. The consumption of dairy and milk and cheese and butter in particular. And so, um, based on a lot of this earlier research, Finland realized they needed to do something. They needed to have a community kind of intervention to try and reduce the burden of heart disease. And they identified that high cholesterol, smoking, and high blood pressure were 3 big risk factors that they needed to tackle. And so they launched a big population wide intervention, and they did, TV advertisements. They were working with the food industry to reformulate foods. Dropping saturated fat was really, really important, as was educating people to stop smoking and
Hmm.
um, educating people to consume less sodium in their diet to help with blood pressure and so forth. So it wasn't just directed on saturated fat, but that was a big part of it. And between the 1980s and 2012, they reduced their cardiovascular mortality rate by over 80%. And in that time, they dropped their saturated fat intake from 22% down to 12. And the ways they did that was swapping butter for plant-based, margarine spreads, eating less animal foods, eating more legumes and whole grains.
Hmm.
And as I mentioned, there was a myriad of changes. So smoking, we can't attribute all of that 80% reduction to the changes in diet. But when researchers have gone back and evaluated the impact of each of the different changes, the drop in blood cholesterol, which is mostly through the changes in diet, has been the most impactful of those changes in that population. So all of that was for me building, a huge case for
Hmm.
reassessing my diet at this time, which, as I sort of described, was very based around animal protein, and with that comes a lot of saturated fat. not a lot of fiber. So I was kind of doing things a little bit backwards,
Yeah.
and it was time to reassess.
Yeah, I feel like most people, whenever they make that decision, it's not the way you you did it. You went deep, and most people think about the science afterwards. It's like the decision is made. That's how I did it. I was like, I made the decision for ethical reasons, and then figured the rest out later. And just happened to be that it also aligned itself to health benefits.
And that's what's great
But
about this. There's so many different entry points.
yeah,
There's no right or wrong way. I just have always had this very curious mind for science and
hmm
went down that rabbit hole.
so I think that many people who decide to go plant based are in that position where you were, for whatever reason, whatever the entry point is, like you just said. Um, they find themselves at a place at a crossroads where like, okay, I want to switch my diet now. I have enough of a compelling reason for me to try it and stick to it. What do I do next? I think this is a really um, important step because it's the deciding factor of whether people stick to it or whether people fall off. What would your advice be given the fact that you've been there, um, but you also now have this knowledge with all the research that you've done? What are some really practical tips for somebody that's in this position? Maybe listening to this podcast is the first time they're like, all right, I'm gonna do this. Where do I start?
Yeah, and so you have that excitement, but then you also have most people in the back of your mind, you'll have a little bit of doubt.
Yeah.
And I had that too. And you have the common kind of fear about, what about protein?
Mhm.
Am I going to lose my muscle mass? So
Mhm.
I got to that point and I realized that I needed to shift my diet if I wanted to lower my risk of cardiovascular disease. But at the same time, I was kind of the view, well, if science says, if all you eat is kale, you can live to 140.
Yeah.
Do you really want to do that?
Yeah.
Like,
You want to live a life,
yeah, like
100 years of eating kale.
what are you potentially sacrificing?
Yeah.
And so it was important for me that yeah, it wasn't going to be a sacrifice in terms of my immediate health
Mhm.
and immediate goals with performance, etc. And I think a lot of people arrive at a similar place.
Mhm.
Um, and so what would my advice to people who are contemplating making those changes? The first would be, I think, for most people, uh, going slowly is better than making a whole lot of changes at once. Now, I fully appreciate that some people can completely change their diet overnight, but it does seem to be a bit more of a minority.
Mhm.
And for whatever reason, they have a very compelling reason behind those changes. Maybe a real shift in the way that they see the world, or perhaps they have been diagnosed with a certain disease, and so different circumstances. But for most people, I think going slowly
Mhm.
is a good step, and probably thinking about the current meals that you're eating, probably one of the biggest levers that you can pull is what can you reduce red and even poultry, white meat in your diet throughout the week, and instead eat more legumes. And that could be swapping out beef mince in your bolognese that you make, instead making a lentil walnut mushroom mince.
Mhm.
And working with your existing sort of recipe repertoire,
Mhm.
but just making those simple swaps.
Mhm.
And another one could be perhaps you like having oatmeal or granola or something, and you can swap out the dairy milk for a plant based milk.
Mhm.
Great thing is these days there are so many different options with plant based milks. Just go out at the start, just go out and find the one that you enjoy the most. keep
Mhm.
it simple.
Mhm.
Um, and and yeah, I think that if you make those changes slowly, the other good benefit of doing that is that your microbiome is given a chance to actually adjust and sort of acclimatize to these new foods. If you go from an average diet, which is probably 12 to 15 grams of fiber a day, depending
Mhm.
on what country we're looking at, and you just jump to a completely whole food plant based diet overnight. It's a little bit like throwing an atomic bomb into the stomach,
Mhm.
into the gut, and can be a little bit unpleasant. So, uh, going slowly allows the microbiome, the 38 trillion microbes that live in our gut that we live symbiotically with, it allows them to adjust, and then you'll start to get a strengthening of the microbes that prefer the plant foods, and over time you
Mhm.
you can build up and you can tolerate more and more and more, and um, you sort of build from there.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. I think that a lot of people that try to go overnight might last for a little bit and initially feel very overwhelmed unless they have a reason to not go back. Oftentimes they do because of it's just a lot of information to digest at once. And then the second step that you mentioned about like basically veganizing your existing meal because that's familiar to you. And normally one or two ingredients are the only thing that's keeping a meal from being fully vegan. I mean, in most a lot of recipes, you can nowadays it wasn't like 10 years ago um, where you couldn't find half as many vegan alternative meats, even if they're not the healthiest or they're a little bit more processed and have some oils in them. Like that is still so available now where you don't even have to change the recipes that you're using. You can just use a like for like
Yeah.
ingredient and then let that be kind of the entry point for you to start exploring more options or more diverse meals that you're not used to creating. It buys you some time
Yeah,
essentially.
exactly.
Mhm.
And I think sometimes we forget. Most people, I think, probably have like 5 or 10 standard meals on rotation.
Mhm.
And so it can be a little overwhelming if you think about changing your diet and you're sort of on Instagram and you see hundreds of different recipes. But really, if you just focus on nailing a handful,
Mhm.
that sets up a large percentage of your meals over the week. And these days, you can just jump on Google, and no matter what you're wanting to make, whether it's burritos or a
Mhm.
burrito bowl or enchiladas or a pasta, and just put the word vegan in front of that,
Yeah.
and you'll get a lot of different ideas.
Mhm. Yeah, I wish I had as many options and recipes when I first went vegan, but now it's like I mean, it's so easy. But it's not necessarily about whether it being easy, it's about being like do you like what you're eating, right? Because if you don't like what you're eating, you're not going to continue eating it. So make the foods that you normally make and taste, flavor them like you normally would, and then just go from there. It doesn't have to be overnight, but that really allows people to kind of maintain their food identity as well, and still adhere or continue exploring. I guess is a good
Yeah,
way
you
to
want to
put it.
still get the joy
Yeah,
out of the
yeah.
food. The other, I mean, how many recipes do you have in your app now? You've got
I don't know, like hundreds.
hundreds.
Yeah, hundreds.
So that's
Yeah.
another great resource. But you make a good point about flavor
Mhm.
because, um, sometimes in my experience, I often do get messages from people who are making changes who say, "Oh, I don't really like chickpeas or tempeh or tofu. It's a bit bland." Uh, Overlooking the fact that with most animal foods, there is some flavor that is added during preparation. Be it chicken through a marinade, for
Mhm.
example, and really these plant based foods that you're swapping in, it's no different. You want to be thinking about the herbs and the spices and the sauces, condiments
Mhm.
that are going to sort of bring flavor to that new medium, that new texture that you've literally just swapped in for the animal protein.
Mhm. Yeah, so, I mean, what would be the next, consideration for somebody that is at a place where they're ready to make the switch? We talk about supplements, or that's often talked about, in regards to vegan diet, maybe lacking nutrients. What are some things that should be, accounted
Yeah.
for? I have an idea, but
Yeah.
I just
No,
wanna
you
give you
know.
the I just wanna give it to you so you can talk about it.
So there are and it's important to appropriately plan any diet.
Mhm.
And so there are huge benefits up for grabs by adopting a more plant based diet or a completely plant based diet. And, those benefits, we've spoken about some of those, but significant reductions in your risk of having a heart attack or a stroke,
Mhm.
significant reduction in risk of developing fatty liver disease, which is the
Mhm.
prevalence is increasing hugely currently. Same with type 2 diabetes,
Mhm.
significant reductions in the risk of various cancers, uh, Alzheimer's, dementia, and on and on and on. But at the same time, you do want to appropriately plan so that you are not just thinking about those long-term benefits, but you're getting all of the various nutrients that you need to feel at your best in your day to day, to
Mhm.
feel vibrant and energized. And so when it comes to a diet that is, predominantly or completely plant-based, there are some nutrients of focus. And some of these you can get through your diet by focusing on certain foods, and then some of them you probably want to consider looking at a supplement. And I guess the most commonly spoken about one is vitamin B12.
Mhm.
And I think most people these days are aware of that, unless you're sort of brand new to this. That's the main one
Mhm.
that you really want to make sure that you are covering, and you can do that through fortified foods, like nutritional yeast and some foods now, dairy, plant based milk, and other sort of alternative products in the supermarket may have some B12 depending on the country you live in. My recommendation though is through supplementation.
Mhm.
It's more reliable, and you need around 100 to 250 micrograms a day, 50 to 250 micrograms a day, or you could take it weekly. If it's an isolated supplement, sort of 2,000 to 2,500 micrograms once a week. Um, on top of that, some of the other ones that would be worth thinking about are vitamin D3, particularly for anyone who lives in a sort of northern latitude, is not getting a lot of regular sun exposure. Vitamin D deficiency is fairly common throughout the world, even in non-vegetarian populations.
Mhm.
Most vitamin D comes through sun exposure, not through the diet. So that's why that's the case. Omega threes is an interesting one. You don't have to supplement omega threes. You can eat flax seeds and walnuts and chia seeds,
Mhm.
and they contain a a sort of short chain omega three, which our body converts into a long chain omega three, which is the active form DHA and EPA.
Mhm.
Um, and I think the research is a little bit out at the moment as to whether that is fully sufficient. Um, what I would say is that vegetarian and vegan populations across the board have a lower risk of cardiovascular disease, and omega 3s are particularly important for cardiovascular disease. And these populations are not supplementing with algae oil. So it's not as if you're not supplementing with it, you're going to be at a huge disadvantage.
Mhm.
But what we don't know is it possible through supplementing with a DHA, EPA, omega 3 algae oil, which you can get, that you may have added benefit? I think it's a reasonable idea as an insurance policy to do that if you can justify the cost.
Mhm.
Um, and so often I get asked, well, how's that different to fish oil? And that's a good question because fish oil is probably the more common omega 3 oil on shelf. Um, and I think the most important thing to understand there is the fish are the reason they have a high omega 3 content is because they feed on algae. And so, given the environmental consequences of overfishing
Mhm.
and the fact that fish are exposed to so many contaminants, it does make sense to be trying to get our omega 3s in a more sustainable way. And fortunately, now there is this growing industry of sustainable algae farming where we can harvest those omega 3s directly, go direct to the source,
Mhm.
and they're putting those into omega 3 capsules like you have in veg, for example. And I do believe in the next 10, 15 years, you'll see a phasing out of fish oil and it will all slowly start to get replaced
By
by
algae
algae
oil.
oil,
Mhm.
um, as more and more people become aware of the environmental consequences of pulling out so many fish out of the ocean on a daily basis. So that's omega threes. I would say iodine
Mhm.
is probably the fourth one that I would consider looking at. That one is relatively easily covered through the addition of various seaweeds into your diet. So nori flakes and dulse flakes. these can be added to the top of Buddha bowls, or
Mhm.
you could use it sort of instead of salt. They have a bit of a salty flavor. If someone's not into seaweed, maybe they don't like the flavor, or just can't commit to doing that regularly, I would consider supplementing with iodine. It's very important for thyroid health. Thyroid, of course, being super important for our metabolism, and so you need about 150 micrograms of iodine per day. If you're pregnant or breastfeeding, it's a little bit more than that. Those are probably the main four. In the book, I write about eight. So I
Mhm.
also write about calcium, and that's covered through food selection.
Mhm.
Through eating lots of calcium-rich foods, and also I think if you're buying a plant-based milk, it makes sense to buy one that is calcium fortified. A lot of the tofu these days has an appreciable amount of calcium in it too. I write about selenium. I think
Mhm.
the best way to make sure you're getting enough selenium is to include Brazil nuts in your diet, pending you're not allergic to nuts. You'll get selenium through a lot of the fruits and vegetables that you eat and mushrooms and stuff through the day,
Mhm.
but just adding one or two Brazil nuts will make sure that you get the right amount. So I think thinking about Brazil nuts as a supplement, a selenium
Mhm.
supplement
Mhm.
almost,
Mhm.
is a good idea. And I should also add to that you can relatively easy uh, reach toxicity levels with selenium. So it is better to think of the Brazil nuts as a supplement instead of a nut that you're kind of buying in the bag and eating the whole bag.
Mhm. Mhm.
That's something that is important to consider. Zinc and iron I write about in the book, but again, those for the vast majority of people, they're covered through foods, through whole
Mhm.
foods. So, and when it comes to iron, I think the most important thing, and one of the most interesting things, is food combinations. So, uh, we can actually increase or decrease iron absorption based on what our meals look like. And this is, one of the reasons why you often hear people talking about adding vitamin C to your meal. So, legumes and dark leafy greens are two great sources of iron. When you pair those with a good source of vitamin C, like a bell pepper or some lemon juice, for example, that will increase the amount of iron in that meal that you absorb. So nature has us covered there.
That's nice. Yeah, I love just how it's relatively simple to break it down with the nutrients that you should be focused on. But it's really it's like it's good to know which nutrients you should be focusing on, but it's relatively simple to get them once you're aware of it. And I think that for most people, you can cover those bases just by introducing those little tips that you mentioned earlier. But those are things that you learn over time and by doing research like this or listening to podcasts like this. And we've spoken a lot about cardiovascular disease on this show so far. But for the young person, the 18-year-old guy that's in high school, um, that's so far away, it maybe not for somebody like you that had such a intimate experience with cardiovascular disease. How do we talk about plant-based eating to the young guy? Like what are some benefits that like maybe for building muscle, for performance?
So two things. First, I'll say is that chronic diseases have a long latency period.
Mhm.
So the the heart attack might show up when you're
40,
41 or
yeah.
50, but the pathology is being laid down in from teenage years,
Mhm.
if not earlier. And so there's a very famous study looking at American soldiers who sadly passed away uh, in the Korean War and from gunfire. So they didn't die of heart disease. And they looked at the condition of their arteries afterwards. And a large percentage of these soldiers who were in their early 20s had atherosclerosis.
Mm.
So they were already laying down the disease. So if you're living in a Western country and you've adopted the Western lifestyle
Mhm.
and your diet has been rich in animal foods, high in saturated fat, and you're in your late teenage years or early 20s, there's a high likelihood that you have fatty streaks and the development of plaque in your arteries already.
Mhm.
Um, so I just want to kind of make that clear that it's not about waiting until you're in your 40s and 50s to make this change. Ideally, you're acting early
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
sort of halt the progression. If not, get some regression, get some reversal of that
Mhm.
plaque, which we believe is possible. But granted, what benefits can someone get from a
Yeah.
performance
I
point
think
of
I
view?
think what I meant to ask was like, you know, that's great, but it's
Hmm.
so far away in the sense that 18-year-olds think they're
Invincible.
invincible,
Yeah.
So if how can you attract them to the
Yeah.
diet through other benefits,
Yeah.
apart from the prevention
Mm.
of
Well, I
cardiovascular
think you're a
disease?
good example that you can definitely build muscle,
Yeah.
and performance is not going to be an issue. There are some things to think about for sure. So, uh, usually, if I'm working like with an athlete, the two main things that I want them to focus on at the start is a consuming enough calories.
Mhm.
Calorie density is there's a big difference in calorie density between a standard diet, omnivorous diet with lots of animal foods, and a whole food plant based diet. The plant foods are much less calorie dense, so your food volume has to be greater. When you look at the
Mhm.
plate, it should look like a lot more food, and that is because ultimately there is less calories per bite.
Mhm.
Um, and if you're not considering that, what can often happen is you transition, you're filling up on fewer calories because of the low calorie density, the high fiber, which these are great things in an obesogenic world where many people actually want to lose weight.
Mhm.
That's a great advantage of a plant based diet. But if you're young and you're wanting to put on weight and put on size, and you've got a high caloric requirement, you're doing lots of exercise, then you're not wanting to lose weight. So uh, in that circumstance, depending on where someone's at, it may make more sense to focus on some lower fiber foods in their diet. And I know that in many circumstances, we're just reducing some of the beans in the diet and thinking more about foods like tofu or seitan,
Mhm.
which are slightly lower in fiber. And it doesn't have to be all. It's not reducing all of the beans in the diet. It's just some. And you're making these little tweaks to the diet to increase the calorie density and to decrease the fiber a
Mhm.
little bit, which will allow you to consume more calories over the day. And then some little hacks, like perhaps it's using smoothies to
Mhm.
work in a whole lot more calories through a liquid form, and putting some nuts and seeds which are very calorie dense. So using those tricks to help you get to that sort of calorie goal and a level where you're not losing weight, and perhaps you're even gaining weight if that's what your goal is.
Mhm.
So that's energy, and just thinking about that from the point of view of if you do transition and you feel like you're losing weight and perhaps you're low in energy, it's most likely that you're not considering calorie density.
Mhm.
It's not that your body's missing the animal foods. It's usually does boil down to you're just not consuming enough calories.
Mhm.
The second is usually protein is a very common one, if not first. And I think there's been some fantastic research looking into this over the last 10 years, particularly in the last few years, that has taught us a lot about the differences between plant and animal protein. And for a long while there was the prevailing thought within the nutrition science and the fitness world was that animal protein is significantly better than plant protein. And I'm sure you've had many conversations about
Mhm.
this and heard people in the locker room talking about it. And so a lot of this was based off of looking at studies where you feed animals different types of protein and you look at the absorption rates. And those studies are interesting, but there are a couple things to kind of note there. They're usually in rats and pigs, and so they're not humans, but they're a model, and they can be, I guess, useful for generating a hypothesis. Now, in those studies, the animal protein has consistently shown up as quite superior, but one of the big limitations of these studies, which researchers are well aware of now, is that the plant proteins are fed in a raw form. And we know that humans we wouldn't eat a dried bean, right? We have to soak it and then cook it. Or if you buy it in canned beans, they're already soaked and cooked.
Hmm.
And that process actually increases the bioavailability of the nutrients. Um, so what we've seen in more recent years, if you look at human absorption studies with properly prepared plant proteins, the difference in absorption, we're talking a few percent. Now, at the moment, that the tests have only really looked at a handful of different plant proteins. So I would love them to go out and look at 50, 100. There are so many, but the information that we have is suggesting that the differences are much smaller in terms of bioavailability absorption than were once thought. That's interesting. But what's most important is, okay, when you consume animal protein or plant protein, what happens in terms of strength
Hmm.
and lean muscle? Hard outcomes. That's much more important than thinking about some sort of bioavailability percentage.
Hmm.
If someone's wanting to change to this diet, I'm pretty sure that's what they're most concerned by.
Hmm.
Um, and there was an interesting study last year in Brazil that looked at male adults. These were untrained athletes, but they were physically active people. They were just not people that were training in the gym on a daily basis. And so they did the first study ever where they looked at an omnivorous diet versus a completely plant based diet, matched for total protein, which was set at 1.6 grams per kilogram. The rationale for that being that that's the amount that science has shown will maximize muscle protein synthesis and the synthesis of new muscle. So two groups: omnivorous, plant based, total protein the same, but one group is getting its protein from a mix of animal and plant based sources, and the other group is getting it from all plant based. And they put them through the same training program, 8 weeks of progressive overload training, and they measured their strength and they measured their lean muscle using DEXA. And by the end of the 8 weeks, they found no significant differences between the two groups.
Hmm.
And so the the conclusion of that study, and I've interviewed the lead researcher of that paper. Going into it, their hypothesis was the animal protein diet would be superior, and he's changed his view, and so now, at least in healthy adult males, the view is if you're hitting total protein, um, and you're exceeding that 1.6 grams per kilo, then there's no difference between animal and plant protein. Or if there is a difference, it's imperceivable and
Hmm.
science is unable to detect
To
it.
detect that, yeah.
Now, there is still ongoing research in elderly. We know as people age, they become a little bit more, they develop anabolic resistance. So they require more protein and amino acids to get the same amount of
Hmm.
muscle protein synthesis. It's just a natural part of aging. So it will be interesting to watch that science and see in different populations, is it the same? But it's it's pleasing to know, pleasing to see this study. I mean, you've experienced this firsthand, so you know that you can build appreciable muscle with plant protein only. But now it's nice to see it being put through in a study format,
Hmm.
and the researchers coming to the same conclusions.
Yeah, I think that even if it wasn't better, if even if it's just equal, that's still like very important because it just gives people the confidence that you can do it and yield the same results. But the difference, maybe not measured by this study, is that the additional benefits to not just yourself, but the long-term benefits of adopting a plant-based diet, the reduction in risk of cardiovascular disease by removing or replacing animal proteins, and then the environmental benefits.
Well, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah,
If we
just
wanted to get philosophical,
yeah.
um, if we talk about protein quality, should protein quality as a definition include the effect of that protein on the planet
Hmm.
and on all life on the planet? And that's a broader conversation. I think it should, and particularly I think that protein quality should include the effect on the environment, given the interconnectedness between human health and planetary health. There are no healthy humans without a healthy planet.
Hmm.
So that's a good point. But as you say, even with the results showing that there was no differences, right? It will be pleasing to know for a huge number of people who are choosing plants over animal protein for reasons that are beyond their health.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that study is probably one of many to come that will help change the paradigm around plant-based eating and performance and bioavailability of protein quality and all of these things that are common arguments of to reason why people are concerned about adopting a plant-based diet. Um, but like you said, the future of our planet is a big one, and you and I just came from watching a documentary last night that highlighted all of the negative effects of our current food systems and how important it is now more than ever to make these shifts towards a more sustainable future for the health of our planet, for a reduction in greenhouse gases, for the reduction in catastrophic global events, the melting of our ice caps, the extinction of certain animals due to deforestation to feed crops that are fed or to raise crops that are fed to animals. It's just also interconnected. So it's sometimes can feel overwhelming to think about all at once. I know I personally feel very um, like doom and gloom after watching documentaries like that. But the difference is like there is something that we can do about it, and that is just to, it's empowering to know that you can make a difference by changing what you eat. And with as many replacements as there are nowadays, it's making it more available, more accessible, more information is coming on the scene to allow us to feel more confident that we're making these decisions for ourselves and the planet. So, yeah, I don't know if you have anything to speak on that, but
Well, I mean, one of the guys that was in that documentary, Joseph Paul, he came up a couple times on the screen. He's
mhm,
a environmental scientist, and he wrote a groundbreaking paper in 2018, and that's most likely why they included him in the documentary. He's come out on record following this study. He looked at uh, nearly 40,000 farms, 119 countries. So a very, very thorough look at how agriculture is affecting the planet and planetary health. And his conclusion was that the single greatest thing that an individual can do to mitigate climate change, to restore biodiversity, to preserve fresh water, is to adopt a plant-based diet. And some of the statistics that were in that documentary, they were frightening.
mhm,
50% of the world's forests have been cleared. Um, it's staggering to think that today, right now, as we sit here, that only 4% of mammals on the planet are wild. And 36% are human, and the other 60% are livestock. Um, you know, for what? For our food, just for our food, we've obliterated these natural ecosystems.
mhm,
We've we've created unprecedented extinction of these species in our lifetime in such a short period of time. In most of this damage being done in the last couple of 100 years.
mhm.
So um, it is staggering. It is frightening, but as you rightly say, it's empowering to know that rather than being completely powerless, you do have an opportunity to vote two, three, four times a day, um, and don't underestimate the power of leading by example, because it's not just the foods that you're buying, it's all of the people around you, it's all the people in
Mhm.
your community that we're influenced so much, but more by what people do rather than what they say.
Mhm.
And so, just as powerful as the decisions you're making is the example that you're setting.
Yeah, they say that you're the average of the 5 people you hang around the most. And if it was normal for all your friends to eat vegan, most likely you would shift. You would have some shift in your food choices. And you're an example of this. Your brother um, choosing to switch his diet, and then you just naturally being around him in those few weeks got you thinking, and then you ended up here, So, um, I think it's very important to also know that, leading by example and inviting people into this lifestyle is a seemingly better approach than casting judgment or making people feel guilty about the decisions that they're currently making. Maybe they're oblivious to it, or maybe they are aware of it and just don't care. And that's also their right to do that. But I think that we invite more people in when we have this approach of, hey, it could be really beneficial for you. I want you to feel good. I want you to experience some of the benefits, and I want you to live longer because I care about you. And maybe prevent yourself from finding yourself in a position where your health has been compromised.
Hmm. Yeah, coming from a place of love,
Mm-hmm.
and speaking, if you're finding that you're in a situation, because some of this can be tricky to navigate, right? When
Yeah.
if you go to change your diet and the rest of your family and friends eat another way, speaking from your point of view, why are you doing it for yourself rather than trying to convince everyone else that it's the change they have to make,
Mm-hmm.
and remembering that you can get very excited about new information, and
Mm-hmm.
sort of, your intent is good. You want to share that information with everyone around you, but sometimes people are not ready, and rather than trying to force the changes on someone, which can lead to a wall being put up, leading by example, um, you know, focusing on process over content.
Mm-hmm.
When you're sitting down with someone and you're talking about things that potentially you don't necessarily fully agree on, uh, focus more on how you're making that person feel, rather than trying to get every fact in.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if you do that, you're less likely to start an argument. And when it turns into an argument, it's th- neither party's really going to learn. So if you focus on just making that other person that you're sitting down with or people feel good, you're going to have healthier communication. And even if
Mm-hmm.
they're not receptive to what you're saying, and they're not changing their behavior immediately, they're going to be more likely to come back to you and inquire in and ask you questions when they are ready. And they're
Mm-hmm.
going to watch along and look at the example that you're leading. And I think that's a far more effective way to create change
Mm-hmm.
around us.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. Um, yeah, Simon, thank you for being here today with me and talking about some of the things we covered. I know we could talk for hours and go much deeper into many different conversations, but I think this was a good um, taste for the audience to get to know you and to also learn more about, like, if you are at a place where you feel you need help or you're interested in adopting a plant-based lifestyle, you want to armor yourself with knowledge, with the confidence that you're going to be doing it in a healthy way, in a sustainable way, then I definitely recommend to check out his book called The Proof is in the Plants by Simon Hill. Um, and if you're more interested in going deeper into a whole multitude of different topics that Simon's covered in his podcast, the Plant Proof Podcast, then be sure to follow him on all platforms, Plant Proof,
Plant_proof.
Plant underscore
Yep.
proof, can't forget the underscore, and Plant Proof Podcast on all places you can find podcasts. So thank you so much for being on the show. Any last words?
Thank you.
Mm.
I appreciate you doing this, and having me back on the show. This is round 2, right?
Yeah.
Round 2. And yeah, I guess if you do get the book, then what can you expect from it?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I wrote this book as what I would have wanted at the
Mm.
time of changing the way I was eating, and so it's a very objective look at the science. I'm not telling you what type of dietary brand to adopt. I want people to find the level of commitment that works for them based on their
Mm-hmm.
personal circumstances. But the idea is to give you really high quality information that you can grab a hold of. It's empowering. Will increase your confidence in the food choices that you're making for you and your family, and is highly actionable. So the book is split into three parts. The third part being all of the actionable steps that you can take to
Hmm.
improve your life, improve your health, feel better in your day to day, and hopefully feel better for longer.
Thank you, brother. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you like this episode, be sure to share it with somebody, leave a comment, leave a review. I would greatly appreciate it. Until next time, I am sending you all love and light.